some familiar faces up on the stage and some less so. Let me go through it. We've got Claire Noon at the end. She's a principal of Nous Group, and she's the head of the regulatory practice there in that organisation. It's an international management consultancy firm with more than 750 people. Prior to joining Nous, though, Claire spent more than 25 years as a senior executive in government, across both federal and state government, including as the Director of Consumer Affairs Victoria for a while, as well as working at WorkSafe and at the ACCC. So she has enormous experience, and Claire and her team at Nous have also been involved with the expert panel over the last 4 years. So she not only knows quite a bit about the building industry, but also about a range of different regulators. Of course, in her role, she's not just doing the expert panel work, but working for lots of different government bodies. Next to her, we have Chris Webb. And Chris is the acting CEO of Resources Victoria, and similar to Claire, Chris has got an enormous amount of experience in regulation across different regulators. Prior to joining Resources Victoria in his current role, he led the Victorian Department of Health's Compliance and Enforcement Division during the COVID-19 response. What was your title, Chris?
Was Commander.
Commander, see? He was the commander of the COVID response. Great title. So undoubtedly that would have been an incredibly challenging time for you. But he has had a range of other operational and transformational roles at WorkSafe, EPA Victoria, and he was the architect of the Environment Protection Act in 2017 when that act went a complete rewrite. Innovator and change agent. As a regulatory professional, Chris draws on a broad experience in other fields, including risk, safety, environmental management in the oil industry and major events such as the Formula One Grand Prix. He has a passion for building and working with high-performing teams and values alignment with being a regulator and providing a public good. So these are our two regulatory experts down the end who we don't want to just talk about, I guess, the building industry and what we're doing, but also to get some reflections from people with some broader experience about how we co-regulate better. Next to Chris is Wayne Liddy, who is the Vice President and Board Director Victoria for AIBS, Australian Institute of Building Surveyors, has over 25 years as a practitioner. And, you know, I've got quite a long CV for you here, Wayne, but I'm going to go the highlights.
Most people know who I am.
Most people do know who you are. And so, you know, with that, we know that he also is a director of Gardner Group, a private surveying firm where he's been for some time, but he's also in recent years worked for the VBA and has a strong relationship with local government as well. Next to Wayne, Steve. Again, you know Steve very well. He's the current MBS at the City of Melbourne, but he's got 30 years of experience in local government building, and including City of Monash and Port Phillip. He's a fire safety qualified as well, and that's one of his areas of passion. Member of FPA, Society of Fire Safety at Engineers Australia and ABES, and he's the Vice President currently of the VMBSG. He's also on BRAC and is appointed by the Minister for that role. And then finally, Andrew, who you all know already and I won't need to introduce. So now I'm going to take a seat and we'll move into this session. To start with, I'm going to ask Chris and Claire to come up and spend just a couple of minutes talking to you and giving you perspectives on regulating and co-regulating, because it's no, you know, what we've got on the stage here is the three major co-regulators in our system, the VBA and SBS through Andrew, Stephen representing councils, and Wayne here for the AIBS and private surveyors. So we want to have a conversation in this panel about co-regulating, how we co-regulate, what we're doing well, what we're not doing well, and how we improve as the three groups responsible, the key groups. We know there's lots of others, but we're just going to focus on these three for this session. So who's going first?
Me. Would you like me to come up or
yes,
just
please.
sit here?
Oh, well, we'll have whatever you'd like.
I'll come up.
Come up.
Thanks very much.
Bronwyn. And I was very interested to see on the slide that was put up before that we have got the 3 main regulators, but there were actually 11 parties on that slide. So when you think about what's the co-regulatory environment for building, it's one that has some additional complexities that you would have seen just by looking at that slide. And as Bronwyn said, I was one of those who was on there as the Director of Consumer Affairs, so I have a great abiding interest in the consumer protection side of the role of building regulation. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I want to talk today, I've been asked to talk about some broader experiences in different regulatory environments. And at NOUS, we've been working a lot across a number of regulators. And one particular one that's of great interest is for the co-regulation of approvals of licences in mining and quarrying, which Anna knows very well, as does Chris, because that's his job. And interestingly, it has 5 main regulators involved in the decision-making for approvals, and that is to approve a quarry or a mine. But it also has 12 other co-regulators to deal with. So where there were 11 on the slide in the building, there are 17 who are involved in one way or another as a co-regulator in the mining space. And so what does that mean and how does it work? So this, in terms of setting the scene, it's a very significant area and it's a very complex process for those sorts of approvals. Multiple regulators have their own pieces of legislation and their own legislative regimes that they are administering as part of that scheme, and they have separate and concurrent approvals in the processes. So that there is a big push in that and a big requirement for that to be successful for people to work together. There are also in this regime overlapping where agencies have powers to set and enforce different requirements as they relate to the same approval. And there may be statutory referral in the application process so that one regulator has to ask another for their view or advice, or one regulator's approval is predicated on another having given their approval. So that is the sort of sense of what's complex about it. And others, while there's approval authorities, there are also those who have advisory roles and for whom you need to get their advice before you're able to make a regulatory decision. So that's the nature and complexity of this co-regulatory regime. And so thinking about that and some of the co-regulatory issues faced in building, we just wanted to draw a bit of an analogy for some of the things that happen. So some of the problems that we see in these co-regulatory environments, and I'm sure you understand these as applying to building as well, they're often vague or overlapping responsibilities. And so there are conflicting requirements or conditions one regulator might impose on another. Co-regulators might provide advice that isn't actually in their remit, or advice that conflicts with another co-regulator in the regulatory scheme. And those applicants or proponents in a mining and quarry situation who go to the wrong co-regulator in the process can also receive confusing advice. So we see that those problems writ large in these complex co-regulatory environments. We also sometimes see in these environments a really rigid and misaligned engagement process. So regulators in these processes can say, well, I'm not doing anything until I'm asked, or I'm only providing the input at the time I'm asked, or I'm only engaging in the process as I'm specifically required to by the legislation, not as a good regulator would. And others, we find there are successive rounds of advice from different regulators in a process. So instead of having an efficient process where all those who have to be involved and engaged in providing input or advice or approvals through a process, they're doing it consecutively, and therefore for a mining licence or a quarry approval, for example, it's taking many, many years for the process to occur. And so thinking about how it might be done well and some of the solutions that are being implemented to try and address those problems, and I'm sure some of the things the panel will talk about today for building. So I've got sort of 10 tips, because it's always good to have a list of 10 things. So the first is about making sure and making clear division of who does what and when, which sort of seems a bit obvious, but it's one of the things that sometimes it's difficult to get absolute clarity of responsibilities in a co-regulatory environment. And to do this effectively, you have to agree which of the co-regulators has primary concern and responsibility in a given instance. So who's in charge? The second tip is where there is genuine overlap between regulatory functions, make a single co-regulator responsible, and again, in a particular instance or for a particular part of the regulatory activity, to avoid the duplication of advice and also just to be much more efficient. We all know that resources are often constrained, and so if you're duplicating effort, you're wasting resources. The third point, and this is one we see often in co-regulatory environments, is don't second guess the co-regulator. So sometimes we see where other regulators have an input, then the work is redone or second guessed or duplicated so that advice is given more than once. Really important tip number 4 is to increase the upfront engagement. So where more than one regulator has to be involved, make sure you're engaging early and upfront. Similarly, on 5, not just increase the upfront engagement, but also where more than one regulator needs to be involved, there needs to be some agreement for the touch points for engagement and how you're going to do that upfront so that you know through a process what is going to occur, and the timeframes for that for responses to if you're asked for assistance or asked for input, making sure that you've got the timeframes for those. And then there needs to be a single source of truth about the process itself. So who's the regulator, who's in charge, how is it going to occur, and is that information available for everyone? So is that information clear and available, in this case for builders, through the process? When we have that, then we want to make sure that we've got alignment with the compliance roles. So regardless of which regulator is primary responsible, there is scope to establish much greater cooperation and information sharing between the co-regulators to make sure it's a really efficient system with compliance activities. But to make all of this happen, you need to make sure, I'm up to number 9, so nearly finished, you need to make sure that the right incentives for effective collaboration are actually in place, so that it's worthwhile actually collaborating effectively. And then all of this needs to be supported by the capability. Not everyone has the capability to actually effectively collaborate, so you must need to make sure that's in place. You need to make sure that leadership is supportive of this collaborative model of working, and also that there is a collective will to actually work effectively and make a co-regulatory system work. And so they're my 10 tips. I will also say with the various regulators we've worked with, and I'm sure the panel will say, it's not necessarily easy to actually make it work effectively, and it takes work to actually make it work. So that's my sort of scene setting and examples and my tips to set the panel up for a great conversation. Thank you.
Right, I'll jump into the space as well. Now, just to lead off, in running through the credentials, I had omitted a couple of bits of information that might be useful. For those who may vaguely recognise me, I did do a short stint back in about 2017, setting up the building division at DELP, and I think I spoke at a previous conference, probably of a similar makeup, and around a similar matter from what I can expect. So look, I'd just say this is a really important problem to solve, and I would encourage you to keep going. To Claire's point, this is not an easy one to fix. Lots of regulators try to grapple with this issue of how do we work with other regulators, and I guess the benefits for this group, I'm a bit thick, so I tend to simplify things so that I can understand them. So I think Claire's just done a great job of running through some really detailed stuff. I take a little bit more of a simplistic view, and really for me, I've grappled with this question myself, working across multiple regulators, and some of the really important problems need more than one regulator to fix it. And so there's a strong driver to try and get regulators to work well together. If you sat down and surveyed everyone in these problems, everyone will give you a different list of reasons why we can't. And my assessment is there's lots of those reasons, not many good ones. All right, so we've got to focus in on the most important piece, and I think that was the piece that Claire ended on there. If there is an alignment of priority, if everyone agrees that this is an important thing, magically things tend to work well together. Now, there's a couple of different ways I've seen this done, and I'll just share some examples of that. So occasionally, something will come up, like, let's say COVID, where there is a very, very strong alignment on a singular purpose of protecting the public. Now, magically in that, I think in that space I worked probably with at least 6 or 7, 8 different regulators, all of whom had the same objective, and magically all of these reasons we can't collaborate fell away and became less important. And we managed to do things, still in that little 2-year period, probably the most profound part of my regulatory working experience is seeing what is possible and being able to take that forward. But that's a shared priority that gets created by sort of external factors outside your control, and probably ones we don't necessarily want a repeat of. I might be getting a bit of feedback on my lapel mic. You can also do it with a bit of brute force, and so there's a great program we ran in the Earth Resources Regulator last year, supported by Better Regulation Victoria. It was called the Quarry Approvals Coordinator. And as Claire said before, if you want an approval to dig a bit more rock out of your quarry, let alone build a new one, you've got to navigate a dozen different regulators, all of whom have different timelines. And so the whole purpose of that pilot was to, as with Earth Resources as the lead regulator, but as the Quarry Approvals Coordinator, to be the facilitator, to get all the people around the table at very, very senior levels across the public service and say, right guys, these are our priorities. This is a state priority. We need that rock out of the ground so we can build that thing over there. And highly effective. In a very short period of time, we managed to put through a series of approvals that probably would have taken years otherwise, were able to be moved through. And we're now moving that pilot to a full-blown 2-year program, and that'll continue. So you can sort of take the brute force method and create a reason to collaborate together. But unless you can find that common ground, these things won't happen. And I think this is sort of the third way, and this is the thing you've got to, how do you make this happen without either brute force or some sort of compelling outside case, and then it's all about trying to create and find a common purpose. Now, in the bio that I sent in, I sort of said, I think we're all here, in whatever regulatory capacity, we're here to do a really important public good, and that's a great way to start your conversation. Okay, there might all be slightly different variations and definitions of which good, but that's why we are created. That's why the regulators exist, is to do a public good. And if you can find that common ground and start there, you'll often find that some of these reasons why we can't will disappear. Probably the 2 best examples I'd give to sort of demonstrate how these things work differently. So back in my EPA days, we had a challenge from then the Red Tape Commissioner to see if we couldn't all start to work in each other's patches as regulators and create this sort of universal soldier model where one regulator can, if they're going to go somewhere, well, they can do the job of 4 other regulators while they're there. And this was a theory, and we said, look, we'll get on board and see if we can give this a crack. And so we started a piece of work between EPA and WorkSafe around major hazard facilities, because they were they were obviously came in under the major hazard facilities regs, but they're also covered by EPA licences. We were both visiting there on a regular basis. And so despite some degree of scepticism in the team, we joined up, we visited these sites, and after about 3 rounds of that, the feedback was, this is not working. We turn up, we confuse the hell out of management, we all want to go off and look at different things, it's become really inefficient, this will never work. And the whole thing flopped. So we said, all right, well, it's a learned lesson. We come back now. 2 or 3 years later, another push came through, and this one was actually EPA, WorkSafe and VBA around, I think it was called the Build-Aware program. I'm looking for nods on it. Okay, got some nods. Now, that was one where we actually did see a collective good in this and a real value. I think a lot of the driver for that was 3 regulators who really felt they needed to lift their profile, and single inspectors going out and doing single visits probably wasn't going to do that as effectively as a cohort coming in. Now, that cohort came in with a clear purpose and a shared purpose. They had the shared value was the fact that everybody gets to lift their profile. And it was incredibly powerful. The writing instructions was all pre-planned. We grappled with the sorts of issues Claire's talking about. Who does what, who's got the best powers in what circumstances, was all pre-agreed. And it got a lot of press coverage. So it was a huge, both benefit to, again, creating the public good, but also all 3 regulators benefited from that collaboration. And from a government perspective, seeing regulatory functions lining up and working together like that also puts a lot of credibility back into the general regulatory pool. So it was a big win, and the difference was the will to make it work. No one really thought that that major hazard one would work, and so it didn't. Everybody wanted that second one, the Build-Aware program, to work, and it did. And I still believe that the collective will, and through that, the alignment of priorities is what makes co-regulation work. And I know in this environment, and as I said, I'm sort of familiar with some of the challenges that we have between, let alone the, what was it, 12 or so, but the 3, getting that alignment and finding that common ground first is so important. And I think once you get there, you'll find a lot of the reasons why it doesn't work will just simply fall away if you can get that ground first. So that's my sort of opening. Again, a bit more simplistic, but that's a great place to start the conversation, I think.
Thank you. Okay. Well, there's a bit of context, and I'm sure we're going to come back to some of these themes that Claire and Chris have laid out for us. But I'm going to start in the middle with Steve. And I want to set a positive tone real early. And I want to ask Steve to tell us, what do you think are some strengths in the way that the VBA works, that private surveyors work, and that councils currently perform their functions?
Okay, thanks, Brian. Really, really good question, and a really important one as well. So I think first of all, I want to highlight that there's really strong awareness amongst the regulators that we're in urgent need of change and reform, and we agree on that. And we also agree on the things that we think aren't working so well. So I think that's really, really important. So we have a really good starting point as co-regulators. There's a real appetite for change, I'll say that as well, and that's really important. And there's a genuine willingness to work together, and I think that's something that Chris just spoke about. It's really important for regulators to want to work together, want to understand what we do and when, and who taps in and who taps out, and at what point in time that happens. There's a really high degree of cooperation amongst the regulators, and I find that's really encouraging, and it's certainly been so at late. There's been a lot of open and honest conversations, particularly around RoleClarity, and I think Claire touched on this. RoleClarity is really, really important if you want regulators to work effectively together. So I think that does happen. I think it's happening a lot more these days. And there's more alignment, certainly amongst the 3 groups here, about what's not working. I mentioned that before, and I think that's really, really important. You can't fix something unless you understand why it doesn't work. I also want to touch on a little bit about something the Minister said this morning, and she spoke about the need for a skilled workforce, and it's something that we've been talking about amongst us for quite some time. And this is not just about numbers, it's about a proper skilled workforce. It's about having, fit-for-purpose higher education available to candidates so that we do get the best candidates and that our workforce is truly skilled. So I think that's something that we're very, very aligned about. So I think there's a lot of positivity in the way that the regulators are working together at the moment.
Andrew, can we comment on some positives?
I was going to comment on some of the things that Steve said, totally agree, but other than probably the RoleClarity piece, that I think there's a lot of work still to be done there. So I think in areas, yes, we've got it right, but I think in other areas, and that's where we trip over each other, and sometimes causes tension. So that's where I think it is continue to work in that space. So we've done some good work there, but I think it's got to continue. I agree too. It is the general positive attitude and approach, and probably the challenge is how busy we all are as well. So we're doing what we're doing. Anything that's difficult and has issues is going to take time and effort to actually manage, and for me it is that engagement, collaboration piece, continuing to engage, continuing to understand the challenges in each area and how we may apportion those responsibilities and activities and support each other really around understanding where the issues are, and as a group considering what the best solutions are and the best process from there. And there's definitely an appetite for that. It's, I think, creating the space and the time to be able to do it now, but I think that's the piece that we need to really dedicate that to move forward.
Wayne, one of the things we wanted to achieve from this session was to talk about things that didn't involve changing regulation and Act amendments, because we know that that's happening, it's coming, we've been told it's coming, we're told today it's coming, but we've got to work with what we've got. So just in terms of what we've got, Wayne, and we can say that we'd like role clarity in legislation, and that would be good, but we don't always get that. So, for example, we've got lots of co-regulators, but in the most recent Act we got 2 more. We got a building monitor and we got a state building surveyor. So we're adding to the number, we're not changing it. So bearing in mind that it's not necessarily about what's in the Green Book and what we can change, or the reasons why we can't change because the Green Book's not clear enough. What do you think makes it hard for private building surveyors to perform their functions?
Thanks, Bronwyn. I didn't think you were going to stop there, so I was waiting for the question. Yeah, look, interesting. In preparation for today, I thought I'd just go back in time a little bit, go back to November 1993 and have a read of the second reading speech that enacted the current Act, which is a problem in itself because it hasn't changed, and you've mentioned that. But I think that in reading that second reading speech, one can construe that the role of the private building surveyor was created to assist the builder. Now, the unfortunate thing is that some in the industry believe that is the case, and that's an impediment. Now, whether it's the builder, whether it's the procurement methods, whether it's government entities, and then we've got project managers, which are the bane of most people's existence in the commercial sector. But then, if we look at going back to that second reading speech and the creation of the Act, it was a role that didn't really change. It was just shifted from the monopoly of local government. So it's a phrase I like to use. It's a role created by government to assist government, and therefore needs the support of government to continue on. The role will improve, and just the role will continue to evolve, but it'll only improve if there's an acknowledgement, and I'm just going to tap onto what everyone said in the opening, the collective will. I think there's got to be the acknowledgement that we need to improve. And in acknowledging that we need to improve collectively as an industry, and in particular building surveyors sitting here today, is that we need to acknowledge that some may have wayed from what the role is. So in improvement, we have to acknowledge that we need to improve and acknowledge that what our role actually is. And the role is pretty clear. I've always said that the role is pretty clear within the Act and the regulations. It's just that, unfortunately, vested interests, no, not vested interests, personal interests have hindered the roles.
Chris, how important is culture in successfully regulating between different co-regulators?
Look, I think my personal view on that is, culture is at the heart of any good performance has to derive from the culture. And I think, what Wayne's touched on there, part of that collective will to improve, as opposed to a sort of a collective shared problem to solve, that is a really strong, sort of within regulators, that willingness to embrace the fact that rather than sit and lament looking over your shoulders about how hard, badly done by you've been and all the reasons why things are like they are, to aspire to something more. And I was talking to Anna earlier about this, that aspiration to be something more than you've been is an important cultural piece because it pulls you. I think often we rely on burning platforms and things going horribly wrong to drive a change, which is great, but if you don't have something you're all gravitating towards, then people tend to scatter in all directions. You need to have some aspiration you're all heading towards, that then is also the point of reference as you progress, that you're all heading towards a single point and not sort of... So I think, and culture's a hard thing. I mean, culture's effectively, it's kind of the way most of us behave around here most of the time. It's a bit of an amorphous thing, but the industry can choose a vision. You can choose this, and this is what we aspire to, and we all collectively agree on that, and then start to use that as the driver to get a change of that culture. I think you can't, otherwise you'll still end up with a culture. You can just have the one you planned, or you get the one you end up with.
Could I add something, Bronwyn? Because I'm sort of, I'm inspired by what Wayne has just said, and to recall something I was talking about at lunchtime, which is the point about, when I'm talking about role clarity in a co-regulatory system, I'm thinking everyone understands whose role is what. But Wayne's pointed to something that we often find in our work with regulators, is that what is the role, what is my role as a regulator in the system? And more particularly, what is the outcome that my role as a regulator is seeking to achieve? And it's surprising sometimes when we work with a regulator and you go and ask someone, why are you here? Why does this regulator exist, or why does this regulation exist? We sometimes lose sight of the outcome we're trying to achieve, as distinct from the process or activity we're undertaking. And I just think that that's another really important sort of guide star to say, why are we here as a regulator? What are we trying to achieve? Because I think when you look to the co-regulatory environment, everyone's trying to achieve the same outcome, and it's about being clear that we're all trying to achieve the same outcome together.
Stephen, that's a good point that Claire makes. How do you do that within a council? What's the outcome? Is it the outcome you're an MBS and you're in a building department, but you're also in a much broader council that has responsibility for administering dozens of pieces of legislation? How do you reconcile the outcomes that you're supposed to be achieving within that environment?
Yeah, that's a really complex question. I mean, you've got, like you said, you have building departments that are responsible for building control. Within a large organisation, a council, you have an MBS who's personally liable and responsible and wants to try and do the right thing, but we have a lack of clarity. And we spoke about culture. There's probably 79 cultures within building departments across Victoria, 79 systems, 79 cultures, and subcultures, underlying all of that. So it is increasingly complex when there's a lack of clarity. So one of the things that we've spoken about for a very long time is the municipal building control plans. They've been spoken about now for over 25 years. And the reason why we feel that's important is because it creates a level playing field. It creates clarity about what the role of this particular regulator is, being the council and the council MBS. Council MBSs need to be supported equally by their organisations that they work for, and they're not. The fact that some council building departments might have 30 or 40 staff and others only have 2 or 3, I think is testament to that. So culture is a really important part. It's culture, first of all, of the industry, but then it needs to go down layers, right down to the individual departments.
Yep, and I mean, perhaps I'll get you to answer the next one, Andrew, unless anyone's got any comments on that. But I guess cladding has been, in many ways, a tragedy, but in many ways a gift too, because it's highlighted a whole bunch of problems. And we heard this morning from the researchers about broader issues in buildings. And that raises questions about legacy buildings, or what do we do in response to these sorts of things. And we've seen through cladding There was, the VBA had certain buildings it was made responsible for, working with councils, and we've got CSV involved, and then there's cladding discipline against practitioners that have been involved. I mean, this whole situation has really brought to life these issues around clarity, responsibility, accountability, and who should be stepping in to help owners and mitigate safety risk in the environment. Just sort of reflecting, I suppose, on the last 5 years, and maybe using cladding as an example. What sort of things could we have done better in terms of the 3 different groups and how we've responded to the community on this issue?
Yeah, interesting question. And I think, obviously it was a challenging problem. And I think my observations, and I sort of came in partway through, it sort of already started, but I think the communication and engagement piece. So, and I think it was further complicated by the mixing of the roles. So, the legislation provides for the VBA to be declared as MBS, and so that was not traditionally their function or their role. So that, in itself then creates a challenge in the environment, and people are basically sort of swapping roles and functions within the process. And so it creates then another challenge around that role clarification as to, well, now we've mixed things up, who does what when. Things like the emergency response functions. So, they're, and we've probably never really got to a good solution in that space, but traditionally if something happens at a building site, then the MBS will go out, and that's traditionally done by the council. When VBA becomes MBS, do they do that? Pretty difficult if they're not located, don't have offices in those spaces, they're centralised. And then you try and come to an agreement and understanding with the councils to do that, but very difficult to do with all the subcultures and the different setups. I think it is that engagement, consultation, transparency and openness, I think too, that when you're handling a difficult problem, a difficult situation, if you have some trip-ups along the way, people tend to shut up shop, and the engagement and the transparency stops, which then really sends you in a spiral, in my opinion, that when things start to go wrong, that's probably when you need to start talking more, and having that trust and faith in each other. And for me, it is that goal. What is our goal as regulators? Putting that right up on a pedestal and saying, well, we're here for public good. So take out self-interest, take out our reputation damage and those sort of things. It's all about, well, how do we get to the core of our activity of public safety, consumer good, and then everything else should then really fall into place below it.
Back to that common purpose point. Chris?
Yeah, I just thought, part of my job here, I think, is to try and be a little bit provocative at least. I just want to come back to role clarity, because it's on my list of the reasons most often given for why we struggle as co-regulators. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think, look, I don't know enough about the various interactions in this legislation to definitively say this. I'll stick to what I know about, but I remember a case back in, it was probably about 2010, 11. There was a house had been demolished down in Geelong. It was basically an empty lot with a pile of asbestos in the middle. And I was at WorkSafe at the time. There was EPA, Department of Health and Geelong Council, all sitting around saying, oh, we don't have role clarity. Who can deal with this pile of asbestos that's sitting there? And I went and looked at it. Now, the reality was all 4 of us could have done it. All right? So I think the first question in role clarity, it's an easy one for people to step back and be avoidant by basically saying, oh, we're not quite sure. First question is, can I do that? All right? And if you can do it, then the second question is, should I? Because often, if you do, everyone else will step away, and that was what was happening in that situation. But I think in these sort of ones where you've got multiple roles, all of whom can take on an issue, someone's got to be bold, take the risk, step up and put your peg in the ground. Because as soon as you've got one person who can define their boundary and step in and be lead regulator, I had to do this recently at ERR around a particular issue, and I said, well, look, it's got the word mine in the front of it, so I guess I'm the lead regulator. And magically, everyone else suddenly can find, they've got their point of reference, and everything else gets made very, very, very simple. All right. So I don't know whether it's the case in this one, don't know, but I'd suggest role clarity is actually, in my experience, more often than not, is not a genuine issue. It's more about the fact that people are worried about stepping in, all of a sudden they're going to get lumbered with the entire problem. All right? So I think there is a need for people to be a bit bold in this space if you want to solve this problem.
Definitely some of that. Steve, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I want to jump in here. I think where this is all leading, I think we've forgotten who we work for. I think we've forgotten what our purpose is. We actually all work for the same person or the same entity. That is the end user of a building. You know, our job's to make sure that buildings are safe, fit for purpose, not just for the day that the occupancy permit's issued, but for its intended life. And I think in some way we've actually forgotten that. And I think we need to start to refocus on that. And I think that's what's been lost. And I think that, Claire, I think you articulated that really, really well. You know, what are we here for? What's our purpose? And I think there's too many interests. Wayne touched on this, and I'm thinking about what Dan O'Brien spoke about before, and he identified a correlation between the relationship between a builder and a developer and the number of defects. That's really interesting. I'm sure he has some stats to prove that. But we often hear about the conflict that building surveyors are in, and it's not bagging building surveyors. I think the system's fundamentally flawed, and we're forgetting who we're working for. We're not working for the person that's paying us. We're actually working for the end user. So our role is building control. Our role is to produce fit for purpose buildings, and I think something's been lost somewhere.
Wayne, do you want to comment on, I guess, well, we're not through cladding, but I guess we're a long way further along the solution for cladding or the response to cladding. What's your take on the private building surveyor and how they have participated in or been party to these legacy issues?
I'd prefer to just answer your initial question if I could. I'm not avoiding that one, and it'll probably morph into this latest question, but listening to everyone's comments there, I think that the one thing we did learn from the cladding scenario, and Chris as the commander of in a COVID response has probably got even greater learnings, but I think something that we don't want to wait for another disaster to have people's heads roll and then regulatory reform that's just orchestrated too quickly. I think what the opportunity that's come out of the cladding debacle, and we can say cladding debacle, the fires, the lack of leadership, it's still ongoing, and I don't even think there's been too many buildings that have been resolved that have had enforcement action placed upon them. But I think the opportunity is to build regulatory capacity out of it. So each of the regulators need to, the opportunity there is now to reset and look at everyone's capacity to deal with these problems. Number one, to ensure that we're not looking backwards to look forward. We can actually address problems as they arise by building your capacity, having the right people in the right jobs, having the right funding where it's required. But I'll say for the third time, building regulatory capacity. I think that's key here.
Yeah, because it's not just, there's always going to be more issues that come. There's a big debate about orphan permits and lapse permits at the moment, and who's responsible and we're not, and you should be, and the insurance won't cover it. We do seem to sort of keep having these kinds of debates whenever these complex issues arise, and I guess part of the discussion today is to lean into that a little bit and work out how we do things a little better. But one of the words that came up in just that recent exchange was around leadership. So we've talked about culture, we've talked about leadership. Has anyone got any thoughts on how that's worked in the past?
Yeah, it hasn't worked.
Why's that?
It just hasn't worked.
It hasn't been there?
It's a regulatory stew, to quote a close colleague of mine. We're still sitting here today. You've been around, I won't say as long as I have, Bronwyn, but we've been talking about this, you and I have been talking about this for at least 15 years. We've got the opportunity now because we've spent 2.5 years of discussion with Anna in her previous role and Claire, and the intel that's come out of those sessions and with all the other stakeholders, I think there's a great opportunity, and we've also got the benefit now, you're going to owe me now, Anna, is that Anna's role as the Commissioner for Better Regulation and the Chair of the expert panel, Anna's now able to take all of that data into her new role with her team and build regulatory capacity to assist in any positives in reform, intel, knowing what has gone on in the past to achieve greater outcomes for obviously the industry and ultimately the consumers.
Yeah. Just mindful of time, I've got one last question for Wayne, Stephen and Andrew, unless there's any comments before I go into the wrap-up. But the question for each of you is, what action or thing do you think would improve the collaboration between the three groups? And I'll start with you, Wayne. And it can't be changing legislation.
No. I think I think we've actually started with, and we're going to end with it by the sounds of things, but the collective will to succeed. We've got the framework. There's legislative framework in place at the moment to achieve the outcome that is required. So we don't have to reform straight away. We just need to do our jobs. And in the absence, Steve's touched on the municipal building control plan. Government's pressuring councils to undertake what their role is under the Act. I mean, the roles are there. I think everyone in this room knows what their role is. Don't kid yourself, because it's all in black and white.
Stephen?
I'd say be open, honest, fearless, hold each other to account. I think never ever lose sight of what our role is and who we're here to protect.
And you made that clear for you, it's the public. Wayne, do you agree? Is that the common purpose?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Andrew?
I agree with what's said, and but just to put something different on the table, was in the lead-up comments was the single source of truth. So for me, that would be a great assistance as well. So having all the information in one place, being on the same page with information, so that we're able to work together more seamlessly. The disparity of information and the different sources of where that's available makes it difficult to make sound decisions and quick decisions, and possibly decisions are being made on different information. So for me, it would be that, and that's probably beating the same drum around a central portal, having all information in that space, so that we're it's more accessible to every party in the process.
Yeah. And I'll get a final comment as well from Claire and Chris.
One of the things that struck me, and we haven't had a chance to talk about, but it is something that we need to think about on a co-regulatory point, and it came from, inspired by you, Steve, was this question about consistency as well. So for the industry in particular, are they getting consistency across? We talked about it in the terms of 39 or different cultures, different approaches, and so that's another thing I think that is a theme that needs to be thought through about how do you think about consistency in regulation per se, and then in the co-regulatory piece. And the source of truth is a good starting point on that one, Andrew. But as a typical consultant, I think we've talked about culture, capacity, capability, commitment, communication, and consistency today.
All the C's. And another C would be Chris.
Look, just a couple of points. I mean, I think just to pick up on these and consistent with what I said before, I think the common shared purpose is part of the equation. The other part of that equation is participation. I'm starting on the P's now, we're going to move to the next one. But yeah, everyone has to take a role in this. This is about a change. I mean, these guys, I'm familiar with them from my short stint in building, are clearly still advocating for this. But I think we need more than just three people. This is about collectively the industry participating in, and to pick up the other point that was made, I think it was Andrew made, that this is a complex system that you operate in, and it's one that's had bits bolted on and bolted on and bolted on, which just makes it more complex. And so don't go looking for a perfect solution. You know, you're going to be faced with a range of slightly less than perfect options. Pick the least worst one of them and go with that, and just get those incremental changes. At some point in time, someone may decide to blow the model up and start from scratch. But until then, the job is to get the best out of what you got. And that's often going to be about the least worst solution available to you, and go with that. And that needs that participation, and keep working it through. And I encourage you to, because again, you're all here to do an important, really important public good. And we rely on your expertise and your knowledge and your experience, and then the application of that in making those decisions. And so just back yourselves in, make those decisions, and share and grow and evolve where it's at until that lovely day comes.
Chris, I know I said it was the last comment, but what advice do you have for regulators or co-regulators where there's lots of history, lots of water under the bridge? We sort of seem to have these scenarios where everybody, as you say, has the power to step in, but they're all looking at each other, and then someone does step in, and the others then criticise them for how they've handled it, and then we have all this water under the bridge in history, and everyone's hopeless. So how do you kind of reset those sort of entrenched or unfortunate baggage that comes with a lot of experience?
Yeah, look, the words of wisdom I always give my teams and myself is, have a very small baggage trolley. These things are an anchor. You drag this stuff around with you for years, it just weighs you down. You just got to let go of some of this stuff. I mean, you'll never make good progress by constantly looking back and telling the story of what used to be. You've got to have something you're aspiring towards, I think, is really important. And the rest of it is just having a crack. I mean, we're in the decision-making game. All right, so not making a decision is death of a regulator. And again, if you don't have any perfect ones in front of you, pick the best one you've got available to you and make that decision. And that's really all the game's about when it boils down to.
Great. Alrighty, we'll wrap that up. Time for afternoon tea. So go and have something else to eat before we come into the home straight.
Beautiful. Thanks.